Yeah, so we're back a week later because I finally got the correct part for Serenity. Because the last time they sent me two right-hand rear calipers, well, that's not going to work out very well if I'm going to replace everything on both sides. And I've already gone through some of this, and I wanted to point out a couple of things on disassembly. Well, of course, when you take everything apart, mine fell apart. It was so rusted out that all of the little parts that hold in the parking brake system were basically bouncing around in the bottom there, and fortunately didn't jam anything up. But I wanted to mention a couple of things. I remember last time when I was doing the fronts, we talked about how much anti-seize lube to put on, and I made a mistake because I thought that I was ready to put the anti-seize. I put a little bit of lube on these landing pads where the shoe rubs. So that's basically just to keep it from making noise. And so I put that on first before I realized that putting on the rotor didn't fit. I was like, why doesn't the rotor fit? Because once I cleaned this off, cleaned off the hub face and the landing where it goes, the opening, and screwed it down, and then realized that the rotor wouldn't turn. And this is something to keep in mind when you're working with two things: aftermarket parts and well, an old rust bucket. 270,000 miles, we expect to find a little bit of rust. And what I found was that it was rubbing here on the bottom, and probably because of either rust or damage. It might be bent, which wouldn't be a surprise. This backing plate is not the thickest thing in the world, but and it can be bent. So anyway, when I was spinning this thing, figured out that it wouldn't work. And so I thought I would mention that, now is the time. If you need to make adjustments, go ahead. This landing here is what was rubbing. And you can see that, it's got a little bit of a thickness there. What's that? Probably 3 or 4 millimeters. The nice thing was that it was only pressing in. I don't even think it was a millimeter, half a millimeter maybe. So I took a powered sander and a salt sander. Yeah, why not? And took off a millimeter or half a millimeter off of this landing, put it all back together, and then it all spun very nicely without contacting anything. And that's also what I noticed when I was putting together the shoes. If you can, when you take apart this thing, line up your old parts and your new parts so that you can get them in the right locations, because like this parking arm, when the parking cable pulls on this, that's what actuates the parking brake. This won't fit on the other side. It only fits on one side. So you take it apart, line up your pieces, transfer them part to part. I had to do a little bit of cleaning because of the rust buildup in here. So cleaned off the back of this arm, and also noticed that, again, dealing with aftermarket parts, sometimes they're not finished very well. This right here had a burr on it, and so when I was pushing this thing closed, it was rubbing and it wasn't moving freely. So just take a file, take off the burr, and everything's nice and smooth. Okay, so next thing to do is, remember I said only a little dab of anti-seize? Well, this is what happens when it gets all over the place after having to go through and, rebrush everything to get the rust scale off because I was having problems with the rotor fitting. So now I'm going to spray it down with brake clean to try and get rid of as much of the anti-seize as possible, and only put it where it belongs, on the landings, and if you want, on the contact points. Also, when I was putting together the I got all new hardware because I was expecting this to be a problem. This is the parking brake adjuster, which I've put together. I don't know why it's not focusing. Come on. There you go. You see a little bit of black goo there. This is a special brake lubricant that I like to use. Brake and caliper grease. This stuff is really good for those threads, and it won't overheat and run out and go anywhere. And so I'll get back to you as soon as I get this thing assembled.